Thank you. All right. Well, as Mark said, my name is Jeremy Wood. I'm the Turkey Program Coordinator with Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, and I'm here to talk today a little bit about declining turkey populations in the state and hopefully an opportunity for you all to help us out to monitor these birds throughout the year, especially during the summertime. So just to give you a little bit of background upon myself, I've been here in Arkansas since late summer of 2018. Prior to that, I was the Assistant Turkey Program Coordinator for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission for a little over a year, immediately following my master's research out of the University of Georgia, the Warnell School, where I looked at movement and reproductive ecology of female eastern wild turkeys in a managed longleaf pine forest. So what we were doing was we were looking at the relation of breeding activities to growing season prescribed fires in a pine landscape, because there's lots of concerns for applying prescribed fire during the nesting season, what potential negative impacts there could be. And then many years before that, I got my bachelor's in wildlife ecology at the University of Maine in Orono. And in between those years, I was working across the country on a host of different wildlife research projects for universities, state agencies, and federal agencies. I'm an avid turkey hunter myself. I'm in my dream position at this point in time, and looking forward to sharing some of what I've learned since I've been here. So for many years, people have been concerned with this perceived lack of turkeys in the state. They're hearing less gobbling activity than they may have 20 years ago, and that's concerning to hunters in the woods. It's concerning to managers because we are seeing fewer birds, during the summer, during our observation periods. Harvest numbers have been declining, and so recently, back about 5 or 6 years ago, managers from across the Southeast, pointed out these declines and trying to figure out what was going on, what was causing these declines. And so they came about and reached out to some universities to conduct analysis of, brood survey data that we had on reproductive effort throughout the Southeast. And one of the major findings from this was that reproductive effort, from the time that most states had started any form of a brood survey, and what that is folks going out in the summertime and counting all the turkeys that they see, including poults or the hatched young from the year, and breaking it down at the end and analyzing it to know the number of hens that there were and the total number of poults that there were, and creating this ratio, and that's called our poult per hen index. And so as you can see early on in most of these surveys, poult per hen indexes used to be well above 3 poults per hen, which you can see on the y-axis on each of these graphs. And since then, you'll notice that every one of these states that I have up here is showing a decline in that reproductive ratio, to the point that now in Arkansas, we're down hovering right around 1 poult per hen. And typically what we'd like to see is a number somewhere in the 1.8 to 2 poults per hen area, because that kind of indicates that you've got a stable to slightly increasing population. So with these numbers now hovering down, as low as 1 poult per hen, we're showing some declines. And through this research, one of the big takeaways was that each state was conducting their surveys a little bit differently, and it made it very difficult to make comparisons from state to state. And so what they did was developed a regional survey protocol. So each state still typically does their traditional survey period as they would have for, the past 10, 20, 30 years, however long they've been implemented. And with that, they were able to then take this regional protocol, which only called for using July and August survey data, and then comparing it from each state across state boundaries. And what you can see is, again, that these reproductive rates they may not necessarily be as high as what were in the previous graph, but some of them are better than others. But in a lot of the cases, those numbers are still much lower than we like to see. And this figure is a little misleading because it makes it seem like everything, you know, is green and hunky-dory. But the reality is many of these ratios are much lower than we would like to see. So moving into Arkansas and trying to get a better idea of what's going on here and what's gone on in Arkansas since the early 80s. If you look on this graph, you have a poult per hen index on the y-axis on the left, and that's indicated by the blue line. And then you also have poults in the thousands. So that's actually the total number of young that were observed during the survey period each year, and that's on the y-axis on the right, and then years obviously on the bottom. And what you see is as turkey populations were rebounding in the state following a lot of translocation efforts and restocking efforts in the state, our poult per hen ratio started out extremely high. And likewise, you know, the number of poults that you were seeing each year was relatively low because there weren't that many birds on the landscape. Well, with increase in reproduction each year, well, I say increase, but increased reproduction compared to now, numbers started to improve and increase substantially quickly. And so you saw your poults in the hen or poults in the thousands go up quite a bit to a peak in the late 90s and early 2000s. But at that same time, despite there being more birds on the landscape, reproductive effort itself was actually beginning to decline and had been, you know, essentially since the get-go. And so we kind of hit this little tipping point in the early 2000s where reproduction started to decline past the point where we would potentially be increasing. And then along with some other regulation changes at the time that provided more opportunity for hunters to be in the woods. You know, we went from a 24-day season to a 39-day season. We went earlier, potentially before a lot of birds had the chance to breed, and hens were going to lay eggs and go in a nest. That we started kind of compounding things. And since then, our reproductive indexes have been declining sharply, except for the years in 2012 and 2013. We actually had some good weather conditions that spring that allowed for really, really strong reproduction, and numbers kind of rebounded quickly. And you can kind of get at that when you look at harvest. And, you know, there's no easy way to understand how many turkeys there are on the landscape. But, you know, what's historically been done is some research was done, and I believe it was in the 90s, that indicated that harvest would be roughly about 10% of what your population would be if you're harvesting the entire male segment of the population. And what they said was that, you know, that harvest being roughly 10%, you know, you'd be able to then multiply whatever your harvest was by 10, and that would be your population estimate. So as you can see, by the early 2000s, you know, we hit a peak in harvest just under 20,000 turkeys, and since then it's dropped off substantially. And so in the early 2000s, we estimated populations may have been around 200,000 turkeys in Arkansas, and in most recent years, we had just over 8,000 birds harvested. So you'd estimate, if all those assumptions still were true, that we'd have near 80,000 turkeys in the state. The one problem with this is that we've made significant changes to harvest regulations where we've restricted hunters that are 16 or older to only harvesting a mature gobbler. Prior to 2011, every hunter that was out there was able to harvest at least one juvenile male turkey or a jake prior to that. And in some years, you know, that harvest was anywhere from 25 to 40% made up of jakes, which is a substantial number. And nowadays, since 2011, our average jake harvest falls at 4% or less. So trying to take that same assumption that harvest is 10% of the population is likely no longer valid. And so we likely have more birds than what our harvest numbers would suggest. I'd guess that we're probably in the ballpark of, you know, a little over 100,000 turkeys in the state. But again, it's, you know, just an educated guess based on some research from the past. And so with that, you know, what's what's driving populations down. And, you know, you hear a lot of things from different hunters out on the landscape, you know, what their thoughts are. And, you know, the unfortunate reality is there's probably no one smoking gun or silver bullet of things that we can fix. You know, some of the major things that potentially are influencing turkey populations are weather, you know, poor springs, you know, cool, wet weather during the late spring, early summer, when hens are on the nest or starting to raise their young broods before they've had a chance to build up enough feathers and resources that they can actually thermoregulate on their own. You know, a lot of rainy, cold days can significantly impact reproduction and cause, you know, a lot of birds to die of hypothermia, you know, where they get too cold and they shut down and that's it. Other things that potentially could impact are things like disease, at least on some local level, anthropogenic issues, you know, turkeys getting hit by cars. This doesn't happen often, but just something that, you know, a lot of people don't think about. And then let's see here. And then one of the biggest things that, you know, we hear about from folks is predators. And, you know, obviously from the time a turkey hatches or, you know, a turkey lays an egg until the time that it's an adult, everything under the sun is essentially trying to eat them, whether it's nest predators like snakes, raccoons, possums, skunks, predators that might key in more on young poults, like avian predators, you know, hawks, owls, and bobcats and coyotes that may try to get poults, but as well as, you know, adult birds. Same being for great horned owls are actually one of the primary predators of adult wild turkeys. They're very efficient and end up, you know, taking birds on the limb a lot of time when they're on the roost. But, you know, with these, there's lots of these have been on the landscape for many years, and turkeys evolved to deal with that kind of predation pressure. And, you know, they re-nest quickly if they lose a nest early enough in the incubation stages. Sometimes even if they lose them late, or even early brood loss, they may go back and re-nest to try to take advantage of, you know, resources available and still pull off a clutch. Other non-native species that are out there, you know, I'll hear a lot about how it's hogs are the problem. And, you know, feral pigs are definitely a nuisance and an issue to many wildlife species. As far as turkeys are concerned, you know, direct nest loss due to hogs, especially in Arkansas and other eastern states, is likely minimal. You know, in a lot of the research that I've been a part of, we know of just a couple nests that were actually taken by hogs where you could see active rooting around the nest site or on the nest bowl. But, you know, outside of places like Texas where nesting habitat and hogs may be more tied directly to each other, eastern populations, turkeys tend to focus on areas to nest that are different than wild hogs. What may be more of a factor is potentially resource competition between the two. And then likewise, hunters. I mean, we are the primary predator of an adult male turkey, even a juvenile turkey, you know, once it's past, you know, 4 weeks to 2 months of age. You know, nothing really is taking those adult birds on any substantial number that would cause any sort of a decline. And I'm not saying that hunting is causing a decline necessarily, but it does have potential impacts, especially if you get harvest rates above a certain period or a certain amount that could potentially limit the number of males that are on the landscape that are available to breed. And then hens likewise would have to do more and spend more energy to, you know, find a mate. Let's see here. All right. So, you know, what else is going on? What else do we think are issues? And prescribed fire, you know, I hear from a lot of folks that we need to stop burning during the nesting season. We're burning up all the eggs. And the reality is, yes, you see photos like this of eggs that have been burned. posted on social media, and a lot of folks have no idea what actually caused the failure of those nests. Out of the three of those, I can tell you that only one may have been failed or may have failed due to the fire that went through. And that was the first picture I showed you. And that was a nest that was on a bird that we did not have a tracking, transmitter on. These other two, I can tell you, failed due to nest abandonment prior to the fire coming in, and then the eggs were burned, but that wasn't the cause of failure. That just was ultimately what people would see if they came across this in the woods. And likewise, a prime example of this is a nest that, again, we did not have a transmitter on this bird, but one of the managers called me to let me know, hey, we just burned over a turkey nest. She, busted up out from underneath my ATV while I was burning, and just wanted to let you know. So I put a camera on it, assuming the nest had failed, and that one failed due to the fire. Well, in actuality, it did not, and that hen tried to raise or hatch that clutch off for 4 more days until a coyote came in and chased her off the nest. And so as you can see, eggs are there. Some of the ones on the outside edge likely weren't going to make it. They probably had been burned to a point that they wouldn't have survived, but the interior eggs were just fine. And in some cases, though, these nests do hatch. And you'll have an area that is burned, and these birds are still able to come back to the nest, potentially if it's late enough in the incubation period, and get that nest off and actually still produce young in a landscape that has been burned, and potentially, hopefully, has really good resources following that quickly during the growing season, because you'll get a lot of vegetation comes up very quickly. And so what we've learned from fire, and I got this data from Dr. Mike Chamberlain from the University of Georgia, who's my master's advisor, and in research that they've compiled with a bunch of different students work across the Southeast that monitored over 600 nests, that less than 1% were, or less than a couple percent were actually potentially exposed to fire, and only 1% were impacted directly. And of those, 2 of them hatched. So, it's a very small percentage that actually failed just due to fire. And out of all the broods that we had, only 1 was lost due to fire. And that, I believe, it was actually on my study site, but in a previous project. And it was because the fire was applied within a day or 2 of that nest being hatched out. And those young just weren't able to move quickly enough to get out of there. In most cases, just after a few days, those birds are able to move relatively quickly and escape a fire if it were to come in. And the big take home is that most turkey nests aren't even in areas that are targeted by fire. Once you get to a point where the vegetation has reached levels that are too thick and too rank for a turkey to want to nest in them, and that may be different than what we perceive as being too thick, turkeys aren't going to nest there. Their predation rates tend to be higher if they do. And it's too thick for them to move in there and potentially escape a predator in most cases. So most of the areas that are targeted by managers have got to this point, and we're just removing undesirable conditions and implementing or reestablishing areas that are better used for brood rearing for a period, and then will successfully become nesting in the future. And one of the big things I hear, as our agency, that we need to stop burning during the nesting season. Well, the reality is, for the most part, we don't burn during the nesting season. It occurs typically from April to July. You'll see a slightly increasing trend over the last couple years, and that's likewise the same this year. And that's been due to poor conditions during January, February, March, when we typically do a lot of our dormant season type burns. And that's just been, we've had very poor weather in recent years. It's not really the norm to focus as much in April. But even still, the majority of these burns that occur in April, which is still a really small amount of acres on the grand scheme of things in the state, they're applied prior to the peak of nest initiation. Like this year, all fires were cut off on April 8th, I believe was the last day they did any burning. and we won't pick that up again until later in the fall, August, September, and try to get some benefits from a growing season fire. And our hope in the coming years is to start shifting some of these fires that are getting applied in the dormant season to be more growing season type fires in the late summer, which potentially will increase forward growth, herbaceous understories, not just be grass dominated understories, which will be more beneficial for turkeys and other ground nesting birds, as well as other wildlife species and pollinators. And lastly, one of the biggest things that we have control over, and one of the probably the most influential for turkeys outside of weather, is have an ideal habitat. And essentially what this all breaks down to is, ideal habitat probably looks somewhere in the ballpark of 50 to 60% forested landscapes to 40% open landscapes in varying different stages of openness, whether it's extremely low growth, green herbaceous growth that provides brooding habitat, or some slightly thicker open growth that can provide good nesting, foraging habitat. And so with my jumping around the Southeast for many years, I worked on several turkey projects prior to my own research and moving to Florida with their program. I have a not unique perspective, but an outside perspective on turkey management in a lot of different states and seeing habitat on the landscape. And the biggest thing that turkeys need is diversity on the landscape, having a good mixture of open land versus forested habitat. And, I hear often that, why do we have fewer turkeys here in Arkansas when all these states around us have many more birds? They'll harvest 30,000 plus turkeys a year. Why aren't we there? Well, the reality is we look very different when you look at the landscape. So if you move into, south central Missouri, you see, and this is where some of their highest turkey harvest numbers come from, you see this really good mixture of open forested habitat across here. It's very kind of a patchwork. And likewise, you see a trend out in Tennessee. You see it in Kentucky. And when we move into Arkansas, you can see that in places. And, this is Fulton, Sharp, Izard County area. This is typically some of our highest harvest numbers in the state. And again, there's really good diversity of habitat within here. But as we start to move throughout the rest of the state, you start noticing that there's some stark differences. You move into the Ozarks around Ozark National Forest, and you've got a lot of mature, closed canopy hardwood and pine forest. Very little open land habitat on the landscape. What there is tends to be down in valleys, riparian areas, where there's development, rural development, pastures, things like that. But there's not much elsewhere, where turkeys tend to want to be or where you hope they would be. Likewise, you move into the Washita Mountain Range, you see the exact same thing. All the open land habitat for the most part is down in these flat valleys in between the mountain ranges. There's little to none up in the mountains themselves. You move out to the Delta ecoregion, and you notice that, with conversion to agriculture and the loss of bottomland hardwood forest, essentially the only turkey habitat in that region is now confined to areas of protected habitat like Watensaw WMA in the lower left of this image, or White and Cache River drainages. Outside of that, though, rice fields, turkey habitat, and there's not going to be turkeys supported in a large portion of this range. And then lastly, I hear often from folks that clear cuts are terrible and, it's ruining the habitat for turkeys. And the reality is the areas like the southwest corner of the state and the Gulf Coastal Plain, that diversity and habitat is actually there, and we're starting to see better turkey numbers in this area compared to other areas of the state, because you can see that good kind of mixture of open land and forested habitat. There are some chunks that probably aren't ideal, like here on the left and the lower left, but a lot of this looks probably pretty decent for a turkey at points, and it may change every 5, 10, 20 years depending on the timber management in the area. but that diversity is helping support birds in that area. And so when we bring this back to, the broad scale in trying to tell folks why, we have issues here, at least getting to the same kind of numbers that we have in other states, is that we've got a third of the state almost that's not going to support a real high number of turkeys in it. What we do have is in the areas that we have good harvest is we have a lot of diversity. And so trying to manage for diversity is kind of key. And likewise, the second highest area of harvest in the state, where people say pine management is terrible, pine's not all that bad. I've come from states like Georgia and Florida that have significantly larger pine stands on the landscape, that turkey populations do just fine there. That diversity can be beneficial for turkeys, but on the other hand, a lot of our public land, that's where I think we get a lot of gripes from hunters, is that we've got a lot of this landscape that is not ideal turkey habitat, being just fully closed canopy forests. And so what can we do as a state? And that's trying to focus more on active habitat management, whether that's through things like prescribed fire, timber stand improvement, which I'll get into in a second. But the keys are trying to manage for nesting habitat. This happens to be a longleaf forest in Georgia, but how many stands do you go out and see like this on the landscape here in Arkansas that have well-developed understories, full of grass, full of forbs? The reality is you don't see very much of this. A lot of the landscape, what you see is leaf litter or pine straw, and that's really difficult for a hen to try to find a place to nest and be successful with the amount of predators that are out there on the landscape that are attempting to find and eat her or her clutch. And so we need to do a better job of managing for conditions that would be similar to this within the bounds of, the habitats we have here in the state. And likewise, we need to manage for areas that provide quality brood rearing habitat, and these are going to be low growing areas, enough to conceal the young, but still tall, short enough for an adult bird to be able to see over that vegetation, have open ground in between so those young can move through it, and they can feed on insects and that green vegetation that's there. And likewise, there's not a lot of quality brood rearing habitat in the state. And so, how do we try to get at this? And that's trying to do different treatment types, whether, again, it's prescribed fire, trying to reset that understory vegetation, clear out the litter, and get back to some quality growing conditions where sunlight's hitting the ground. Timber thinning, things like, getting in there and trying to reduce in the basal area, whether that's through a commercial harvest to remove some trees, or it's going in there pre-commercial and, doing things like mulching, where they actually take equipment in and grind trees to the ground and mulch them up, and then do a burn in there to clear that fuel and debris on the ground. Other methods are using chemicals like herbicides to chemically inject trees and kill them off, so open pockets either in the overstory or the mid-story and get more sunlight on the ground. Establishing more open land habitats in the state, removing some trees and putting some of the landscape back into probably what it was at one point in time, where it was more open, whether that's native grass and fallow fields. And some of us still can have trees in it. A lot of our landscape formerly was more of a woodland or a savanna, which would have been less dominated by trees than they are now, but still would have had enough canopy gaps to allow for vegetation like you see in this image in between trees. And lastly, things like herbicide application itself, in open land situations where you're trying to reduce woody encroachment, things like sweet gum and other tree species that are trying to come up in these open areas and take over and shade out all of that really beneficial growth in the understory.
Jeremy?
To kind of point this out. Yep.
Patrick had a question. Patrick, you want to just unmute and ask?
Yeah, sure.
Hmm.
Hi, Jeremy. Yeah, so I was just wondering what the trend is in terms of number of hunters in Arkansas. Do we have more turkey hunters now than we used to, or fewer? And also, um, how many hunters come from out of state to hunt in Arkansas?
So yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we don't have a good method of understanding how many turkey hunters we have in the state. At one point in time, there was a required permit for folks to get, so we had a good number, but that was back in, I believe, the 90s or even the 80s. And at that time, they estimated 50 to 60,000 turkey hunters in the state. In recent years, we've done some surveys where we've looked at the number of, or sent it out to all licensed hunters or a proportion of all of our licensed hunters to get an idea of what species they targeted. And with those, they indicated upwards of about 40% of our licensed hunters were targeting turkeys. And that would end up estimating our turkey hunter numbers up in the low, 110 to 130,000 mark, which would be a substantial increase over the years. And though we don't have anything exact here in the state, many other states like Missouri and Florida are kind of seeing those same trends where despite hunter numbers in general declining, it seems like more hunters are picking up turkey hunting in addition to, their deer hunting and other pursuits. So there's actually, turkey hunting is bucking that trend where we actually are seeing either stable or increasing turkey hunter numbers on the landscape. And can you repeat the second part of your question? I lost my
Well,
train.
I was wondering if we had any idea about how many hunters were coming from out of state
Yeah.
to come to Arkansas to hunt. I mean, I know a lot of guys that, travel all over the place to turkey hunt, and I was just wondering, if Arkansas was getting its share of
I have not since I've been here. I have not pulled our license data on that. The unfortunate reality is we have, especially for annual licenses, we don't know how many of those just come to deer hunt or if they're coming back at different points throughout the year. But what I intend to do here is to look at, especially our daily or short-term license sales, the 1, 3, or 5 day permits that are available, I believe, to get an idea of how many of those we're selling in and around turkey season, to understand, how many non-resident hunters are coming in. I anticipate that it's lower than many states due to the fact that we have lower numbers. It's more of a challenge to hunt here. So in some cases, folks are coming here to do that and, challenge themselves. But I think in most cases, folks are looking to have the best bang for their buck if they're going to go out of state. So a lot of times Arkansas is not their target. It's not like a state like Florida that has the Osceola subspecies, and it's the only state, in the U.S. or in the world that has that subspecies. So you've got a kind of commodity there that a lot of hunters like to try to go pursue. Whereas we have the eastern wild turkey subspecies, which occurs over the broadest area of any in the country. It's pretty much everywhere east of the Mississippi, all the way from the Gulf Coast all the way up to the Canadian border and even in a couple Canadian provinces.
Okay, thanks.
All right. So to get back here, what I wanted to point out was that, I just talked about a lot of those treatment types. And the reality is you may not be doing just one of those. It's likely you're going to need to have a combination of those to restore habitat. So I believe this was from Washita WMA, and there's an area that used to be more of a oak savanna or oak woodland, if you will. And as you can see on the upper left, as more and more trees came into that area with lack of disturbance through things like fire that would have typically been in there, all these other trees came in that started shading out that understory. And you can see remnants of it there and on the ground, a little bit of grass here or there, but for the most part, it's bare dirt, not bare dirt, but leaf litter. And so managers wanted to go back in there and start resetting that to that woodland habitat that it should be. And so they started out and they did, I believe it was a commercial harvest, which you see in the upper right. And as you can see, it removed a lot of those mid-story trees, competing with those those mature overstory ones that were left. And all that debris was left on the ground. They went through and did a burn. And in 2006, you see in the lower left, you started seeing really good response from grasses in the understory that wanted to be up and providing beneficial habitat for a lot of different species. I'm not saying the vegetation wanted to do that, but it was there underneath all of those trees. It just needed sunlight and some bare ground to jump. And then the following year, 2007, you can see it's even better. So if you were a turkey and wanted to nest or raise your brood, would you want to be going through the area in the upper left or the lower right? And I'd say in most cases, the turkey is going to look at that area in the lower right and say, that's just right. That area in the upper left, I'm going to have to pass on that and keep looking and searching for a place that I can lay my nest. And if you happen to have private land and you're interested to do anything like that, our private lands program is a really great resource. It's free to have these folks out your property and discuss potential management you can do on your land that will benefit, whatever your objectives are, whether, you'd like to manage for turkeys, manage for bobwhite, deer, what have you, they'll be able to give you recommendations to suit your objectives for your land, and give you some ideas that maybe you haven't thought of or you may need to think of if you'd like to benefit those species. And this is available on our website under the, I believe it's the Wildlife Management tab in private lands. And what else can help? A lot of the messaging that I've been working on is trying to tell folks to avoid using supplemental feed throughout the year, especially between March and the end of July when birds are actively nesting and brooding. If people are putting out corn for deer, the intention in a lot of cases is either keep deer around or hopefully grow bigger antlers. And the reality is it's not happening in most cases. You have to be spending exorbitant amount of monies to actually provide enough forage to benefit those things more than what age alone will do. But at the same time, you're attracting a lot of other species that take advantage of these, like raccoons, and artificially supporting higher numbers of those animals that then in turn can raid nests and try to take young, which potentially lowers the reproductive turkeys in those areas. Other thing to do if you own land and you don't have a economic stake in that, running haying operations, avoid recreational bush hogging or cutting of that hay until at least around the 15th of July. That should get the majority of your ground nesting birds hatched off and moved off to where they can escape, that equipment, rather than, potentially cutting up a bird that's on the nest or destroying, breaking up a nest. Another thing that folks can do is considering limiting harvest on their properties. Typically we say that you don't want to harvest more than 25% of the male segment of the population. So if you take that to a small scale area, if you go out and you run trail cameras each year and you only end up seeing, 2 birds on your property, probably wouldn't shoot both of those birds, hoping that you have some for next year. You might still be able to handle shooting one, other ones might move in from other properties, but try to weigh those decisions based on what you're seeing on your land. Likewise with access, try to avoid disturbing your land following turkey season for a few months. Minimize your trips in. A lot of birds like to nest in and along roads, so driving up and down these on a continuous basis can disturb them, potentially again lower that reproductive success. And the last one I put in here, and I put it specifically last, is going out and trapping some of the predators around the landscape. What's going to do more than trapping will ever do is improving that nesting and brooder and habitat, and that alone can help redistribute predators on the landscape that may end up having a positive impact on that reproductive potential. If you don't do that, and you just trap, you might save some nests, but in most cases, you're not removing enough animals to have any positive impact alone. But if you couple trapping with that habitat improvement, that's when you have the best chance of having any sort of success. Typically, what I recommend is taking advantage of the traditional trapping seasons and making sure that these animals are used, at least in some part for their fur in January and February in some areas. And this will allow for at least some removal just prior to nesting and hopefully create some voids during that time that some of those hens can be more successful than they otherwise would have been. If that's still not enough and folks feel like there's still an issue, we do offer a predator control permit, which allows private landowners to work on these populations on their property outside of the traditional trapping season. And what I recommend that if they're going to spend any effort to do that, that they focus essentially February, March, and April just prior to nesting, because that's likely to have the most beneficial impact. Trapping throughout the rest of the year really isn't likely to do much other than just create little voids and then quickly get filled in from behind. But lastly, how can you help? And kind of the big premise for me coming to speak with your group this morning was that we have opportunities and we're trying to reach out to the public in a broad variety of groups, whether that's hunters, and we do an annual spring gobbler hunting survey. So I hope that any of you that know some hunters, encourage them to take part in this. You can find all of these surveys on agfc.com/turkey surveys, but we have an online survey tool for that, as well as a traditional paper survey booklet like you see in the image on the right. But primarily what we're really hoping for with folks is to try to encourage more observations during the summer and really throughout the year. We're actually going to open this survey year round starting this summer in June. We'll look at it a little bit different, but we still want to monitor obviously our typical brood rearing period from June to the end of August so that we can still work with a lot of the surrounding states to monitor reproductive effort. But this is a really good tool for us to understand the distribution of turkeys in the state, potentially the density. We're starting to work on some methods to acquire some calculation of user effort, how many hours folks may or may not have been spending in the field to help us. So with this, we're looking for help so that we can start filling in some gaps. We got a lot of good participation last year in 2019 when we opened it to the public, but there's a lot of gaps out here. And you'll notice, in and around Hot Springs, in and around, Fayetteville, areas that can support turkeys, but we just don't have enough people out there that if they see a turkey, reporting those observations for us. And because the more of those observations that we have, the more confident we can become in the estimates we have on either where birds are, what that reproductive output looked like. Because, you think about if you have 10 observations and you estimate that your reproductive effort was, 5 poults per hen just because you had a few really good clutches, you can imagine that if you had 100, all of a sudden that may drop to 1 poult per hen because the rest of them had very poor reproduction. So with low numbers of observations, we have really high variability in those estimates. The more and more that you get, the more refined your estimate can be, and hopefully we as managers can have a better idea of what's going on. And if we do ever get to a point where we can do something that's more adaptive with our harvest management, that we'll know reproduction looked poor this year, we need to maybe pull things back a little bit for the following hunting season or things like that. There is the traditional paper version of our brood survey. I have this for the northern bobwhite as well as quail. And so essentially what we're looking for is folks that can provide information on, when they're out, if they see birds, it's fairly simple information. We just look for, a rough location using GPS location, as well as estimates of, the number of young that you might see number of adult birds that you might see. It's very similar for turkeys. And with that, whether or not you've seen them previously during the survey period or not. And this just really helps us put more dots on the map. We're going to move to the question slide here, but I'm briefly going to pull up our online survey tool just to show you in case some of you may be interested in participating that way. Hopefully this pulls up on the right screen. So we're actually in the process of revising this right now to make it a little bit more user-friendly and make it a little bit better for us on the back end when we go do the analysis. If you follow that agfc.com/turkey surveys, it'll bring you to this page. And so if you're out, hunting during the spring, you click on the spring gobbler hunting survey. But for this talk, I'm just going to bring us to the summer turkey and quail brood survey. And it's going to bring you to a page that looks like this. You'll have the option either to print the paper version of the survey if that's how you would rather participate, or you can click on the online and mobile version of the survey. I'm going to disable this link soon just so that folks don't go in there and look at the previous version. I'm going to show you what the new version is looking like today. This is the first time we've actually shown it to the public, and we're going to still probably be tweaking this a little bit. But essentially, we try to capture your name, what your affiliation is, whether you're just a member of the public, because what we're needing to do here is try to continue to compare to our historical survey data that wasn't open to the public, and it was open more to just natural resource students and professionals. So we have those separated out, but then at the end we can combine them all back in and get one estimate with everything, but then also pull it apart with just the natural resource students to see if it differed any. My hope is that moving forward, we won't even have to bother with this because the estimates will be the same and it will just have more observers. You indicate the date that you're out there observing, the county which you saw the birds, or we're hoping to try to capture again this idea of effort. So if you've been out and you haven't seen birds, we'd like to understand that at the end of each month. If you've been out all month and haven't seen any birds, you'd indicate, you live in Ashley County and, didn't happen to see any. And in a minute, you'd be able to offer, how many hours you felt like you were out and about that you likely could have seen them if they were there and you just didn't. We'll ask for an exact location so you can move either using the location estimate on the map or scroll the cursor to where you were if you're no longer where you saw the birds. You can indicate whether or not you saw turkey or quail. Or if you did not observe quail or turkey. And simply, we're just asking for an estimate of how many hours you felt like you were there, could have seen birds that month. But I'm going to pull us into the turkey one just to be real quick. And we're looking for a measure of how many hours you may have been outside up to the point that you saw birds that day. So if you were out for only a couple hours, you hit 0 to 2 hours or 2 to 4. And then record just the number of birds you've seen, whether or not you saw males, so gobblers or jakes, number of females, number of unknown if you weren't able to actually identify what sex the birds were, and then the number of poults that you observe. So, if you see a hen that has 8 poults, you put 1 in the hen column or the female column above, and then 8 poults in this estimate. And then you'd assume at that point that was one brood. If you had multiple hens, you may have the potential for multiple broods. You just have to use your best judgment looking at whether or not there's different age classes or if there's an exorbitant number of poults running around with those birds that likely are not from one bird. Typically a nest has 12 eggs in and around there. So, if you've got a group of 3 or 4 hens and you've got 20 odd poults running around, there's likely to be at least a couple broods in there, if not more, depending on what the age estimates look like. And then we ask, if you're able to provide an estimated age of the young, and we provide some line drawings to give you an estimate of what they should look like. We didn't want to go with actual pictures and skew somebody from looking at the actual characteristics rather than potential variation that you may see between young, and feather coloration, things like that. And that goes all the way out to 8 weeks of age. And then whether or not, like I've mentioned, that you had recorded those birds previously, and then you hit submit, and that way we have that kind of real-time data. We get that immediately, and then we can start focusing, marketing efforts or outreach efforts in areas where we may be lacking observations and need to try to boost them. So with that is all I have. I'd be happy to take anybody's questions. I appreciate you all giving me the opportunity to speak with you this morning. And one last thing, if you're interested, feel free to consider buying a turkey stamp. It's a voluntary stamp. It's a beautiful piece of artwork done by one of our communication staff, and she's very talented. And it depicts a gobbler and a hen in a recently burned area, taking advantage of the understory growth. And it's a really great image. And all the proceeds, the net proceeds, we do have some costs associated with producing the stamp. So after those are paid for, all of the net proceeds are going to go to benefit habitat for wild turkeys on the landscape, as well as, other species that are going to benefit from those, like quail, pollinators, you name it. Anything that takes advantage of habitat conditions that provide, low understory vegetation. So with that, any questions you all might have?